Hey Apple fans, Apple Sheep, and anyone else out there watching, Richard here with iTalk, and this is a review of my brand new 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro, spec'd out with a 10-core CPU, 32-core GPU, and 64 gigs of unified memory. You know, I've been a Mac guy for 30 years, since 1991. Before Mac, I guess that means it's time to end the intro. Okay, we are back and we're going deep, and I mean
deeper. I don't want no more money or nothing, but I'm going deep, 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 deep under the cover
of this MacBook Pro. We put the timeline in the description, so if there's something specific you want to watch and move on, you can easily find it. So buckle up and let's get right into it. I've been using this M1 Max machine for a few weeks now, and so far there is just so much to love about it. And there are a few things that I'd like to see tweaked, which I'll cover more toward the end of the video. So let's get right into it, and first up, external design and look. Just look at the overall aesthetic design. It is absolutely beautiful. I got mine in space gray, which I personally love, and with beautiful clean lines and gorgeous rounded edges, it kind of takes me back to the original 2006 MacBook Pro design, which was stunning. Also, with the slightly rounded edges, it just feels much more comfortable in your hands rather than the squared off sharp edges of the previous generation MacBook Pro. Precision etched in the bottom of the machine is MacBook Pro, and it looks great. Build quality. This thing is really robust. It feels quite sturdy and durable, exactly what you'd expect from an Apple product. The build quality is simply outstanding. All right, let's talk size. The new MacBook Pro models with 14 and 16-inch screen sizes are larger than the previous generation 13 and 15-inch models. But what does that do to the overall footprint of the new machines? Surprisingly, not much at all. The overall size of the new MacBook Pro models are ever so slightly bigger than their older siblings, but unless you stack them on top of each other, you really don't notice the difference at all. And the weights? The 14-inch is about a half-pound heavier than the previous generation 13-inch model, and the 16-inch is a little less than a pound heavier than the previous generation 15-inch model. Definitely a little noticeably heavier, but I got used to it pretty quickly without any difficulty, and it's really a small price to pay for a far superior machine. Now for the ports. On the left side, there's the lovely MagSafe port. MagSafe is back, and I love it, and it really never should have went away. There are also two Thunderbolt 4 ports and the headphone jack that, according to Apple, supports high impedance headphones, and that rounds out the left-sided ports. On the right side, we have HDMI 2.0, a third Thunderbolt 4 port, and an SDXC2 card slot. So with all these new ports, you can connect 3 4K monitors, a 4K TV, high impedance headphones, and transfer data from an SDXC card, all at the same time. Vastly improved connectivity. Now, some people have commented, or rather lamented, on the lack of a USB-A port. Personally, that doesn't bother me. I haven't used anything with USB-A for several years, and if I do happen to need it, I can certainly deal with one little adapter. Notice the lack of MacBook Pro at the bottom of the screen casing, and again, it's replaced by the MacBook Pro etched in the bottom of the machine. The speaker housing looks identical to the previous generation, but oh, how the speakers have changed. Holy cannoli, Italian Batman, the new speakers are nothing short of incredible. More on those later when we talk about internals. Moving right along, the keyboard. Longer travel keys, including full-size function keys with new shortcuts for Spotlight, Siri and dictation with one integrated key, short press for dictation, long press for Siri, and a Do Not Disturb shortcut key. Basically, the Magic Keyboard incorporated into the MacBook Pro with the added full-size function row keys. The backlit keyboard is really nice, and in low light, it's really bright. The black anodized aluminum inset matches the black keys, and it looks fantastic. The keys offer great feedback, the perfect travel distance, and a really nice tactile feel that are no longer clicky and clanky like the no-travel keys on the wretched Butterfly keyboard. Even after multiple iterations and revamps, it was still just terrible. Bye-bye Butterfly, rest in peace, and good riddance. Gone too is the Touch Bar, which for most people is a welcome and frankly long overdue move by Apple. Personally, I liked a couple of the Touch Bar features, like the slider for keyboard and backlight, as well as for volume control. But for the most part, that was about all I used it for. I never really used it within apps, so I don't really miss it that much. The screen, the Liquid Retina XDR display on a laptop. This screen is absolutely gorgeous. ProMotion is buttery smooth, and the difference without it is easily noticeable. But if you don't like ProMotion, and I'm not sure why anyone wouldn't, but if you don't, you can go into display settings and set the refresh rate to a variety of static ones. But again, why? ProMotion saves battery and automatically adjusts, and it just looks so much better. More on screen design detail later when we talk about internals. And finally, the ForceTouch Track Pad. Bar none, the best trackpad out there. Buttery smooth, great feel. It works just as well and feels exactly the same no matter where you press it. There's simply no other trackpad that even comes close. Moving right along to internals. This is where we really deep dive into pretty much every major component of the machine, including M1 Pro and M1 Max. And speaking of the chip, we have some Geekbench and Cinebench R23 scores. Some we did ourselves and some we'll reference. We also performed temperature and power consumption tests and some render speeds. We'll also talk about the speakers and spatial audio in Dolby Atmos, the display, and the camera and the batteries. So let's go. M1 Pro and M1 Max. So we all know that these chips are fast, blazing fast. Part of it is the SoC design with the unified memory architecture, saving significant time in transfer data back and forth between chip components. But a less well-known but equally important factor that makes these chips so incredibly fast is their vastly increased memory bandwidth. M1 Pro is equipped with two 128-bit LPDDR5 modules, providing an incredible 256-bit LPDDR5 architecture, which translates to 204 gigabit per second bandwidth. M1 Max is astonishing with a massive four 128-bit LPDDR5 modules for a staggering memory bandwidth clocked at over 400 gigabit per second. All of this on a minuscule 5 nanometer process. These processors, and I don't say this as hyperbole or exaggeration, these processors are transformative, period. They have and will continue to revolutionize the computer industry. And these are still essentially entry-level chips, just the first generation of Apple Silicon. So let's talk configurations. Chip configuration. M1 Pro starts with an 8-core CPU, 2 Ice Storm E cores, and 6 Firestorm P cores, and a 14-core GPU. M1 Pro is configurable to a 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU. M1 Max has a 10-core CPU, no other CPU options on M1 Max, and can be configured with a 24 or 32-core GPU. Both have a 16-core neural engine. Both have essentially identical media engines, except M1 Max has an upgraded media engine on the 16-inch highest tier 3499 model, with 2 video encode accelerators and 2 ProRes accelerators instead of just 1 each. Machine configuration. Apple has surprisingly really made both the 14 and the 16-inch models highly configurable. Both can be configured with either the M1 Pro or the M1 Max, and the 14-inch model can be spec'd out with the same options as the 16-inch model, including 64 gigs of unified memory. However, the upgraded media engines again are only available on the $34.99 16-inch model. But other than that, how you configure it depends on your personal needs and screen size preference. I chose the 16-inch model because I just like the larger screen. Performance. We looked at Geekbench CPU and GPU scores, some reported by Apple Insider and some by Constant Geekery, and some of our own. We also did some power consumption testing and temperature testing, as well as render speeds. First, Geekbench. Apple Insider compared Geekbench 5 single and multi-core scores between M1, M1 Pro, and M1 Max. The single-core scores were off the charts, all over 1700, and surprisingly very similar. This is because Geekbench scores are based on the P-core, which is identical on all 3 processors. In multi-core scoring, M1 Pro and M1 Max both blow away the M1. Again, this is not surprising because M1 Pro and M1 Max are P-core heavy. It's also not surprising that M1 Pro and M1 Max perform nearly identically in multi-core scoring. Constant Geekery compared M1, M1 Pro, and M1 Max with the Razer Blade 13-inch 1165 Q7 16 gig processor. Single core scores were similar, but in multi-core scoring, all of the Apple Silicon processors pretty much blew it away. In our own performance testing, we compared my new spec'd out M1 Max MacBook Pro with the 2021 12.9-inch M1 iPad Pro, the 2017 Intel quad-core 3.1 GHz Core i7 15-inch MacBook Pro, and the 2020 10-core Intel Core i9 27-inch iMac with 96 gigs of RAM, and the upgraded Radeon Pro 5700 XT graphics card with 16 gigs of GDDR6 memory. On single-core Geekbench scoring, not surprisingly, M1 and M1 Max performed very similarly, while completely demolishing both later model Intel chips. In multi-core scoring, M1 Max left the others in the dust. Interestingly, my M1 iPad Pro performed very similarly to my $4,000 iMac. In GPU scoring, the M1 Max outperformed the iMac by over 10% and obliterated the iPad and the 2017 MacBook Pro. Render speeds. To test render speeds, we rendered a 4K 50 gig file formatted in Apple ProRes 422 and standard Rec 709 color format, with all machines plugged in. And here's what we got. M1 blazed through this render like a hot knife through butter in 2 minutes and 29 seconds. The iMac, the 2020 iMac, Core i9 10-core, took a yawning 5 minutes and 5 seconds. And the 2017 MacBook Pro took a mind-numbingly slow 8 minutes and 45 seconds. Now, this is twice as fast as the 2020 iMac and 3.5 times faster than the 2017 MacBook Pro. For fun, we also rendered the same video with the M1 Max on battery to see if performance suffered. On battery, it actually rendered it in 2 minutes and 27 seconds, 2 seconds faster. So it's safe to say that on battery, performance does not suffer at all on this machine. All right, let's look at temperature. For temperature measurements, we used iStats menus. All temperatures are in Celsius. Again, we looked at idle and during Cinebench scoring, which, by the way, Cinebench really big time stresses the system. The 2017 MacBook Pro at idle, 59 degrees, and during Cinebench, 64 degrees. The iMac at idle, 64 degrees, and stressed 74 degrees. The M1 Max had an interesting result. At idle, 44 degrees, and stressed with Cinebench, 95 degrees. We repeated it several times and got the same results. As soon as Cinebench stopped though, within a few seconds it was really right back down in the 40s. And even at 95 degrees, the fans never spun up faster than about 1800 RPMs, which is pretty much at idle. And even when they were running, I could barely hear them, even with my ear pretty much pressed against the machine. I did call Apple and they couldn't explain it, and I really don't know what to make of it either. But given that it didn't feel warm, the fans were barely spinning, and it was operating normally, I think it's fine, and it seems that the advanced thermal system Apple touted at the October event is probably for real. And part of it you can see just looking at the machine. Larger vents on all sides and slightly higher feet to keep the computer just a little higher off the surface certainly helps. Finally, we looked at power consumption. At idle, M1 Max drew an unbelievably paltry 11 watts. And while rendering that 50 gig video, only 30 to 39 watts. The iPad, 9.5 watts. The 2017 MacBook Pro, about 35 watts at idle and about 85 watts during render. And the iMac, an energy-sucking 129 watts at idle and between 220 and 230 watts during render. It'll really be interesting to see the power consumption on the upcoming Apple Silicon iMacs. So then, with all the similarities between M1 Pro and M1 Max, you might ask yourself, why bother with spending the extra money on M1 Max over M1 Pro? Well, M1 Max will still outperform M1 Pro for a variety of reasons. First, it has twice the memory bandwidth. Second, M1 Max doubles the system level cache of the M1 Pro at 48 megs versus 24 megs. Finally, M1 Max packs a monstrous 57 billion transistors, with M1 Pro relegated to working with only 33.7 billion transistors. Poor little M1 Pro. And there are other features of the M1 Max that give it better performance over the M1 Pro. Let's talk sound system. The new speaker system is a 6-speaker sound system with 80% more bass. Included are 2 larger tweeters and 4 force-canceling woofers that have a wider range of motion that allows for deeper bass and an overall richer sound. And these speakers sound fantastic. With the larger woofers and wider range of motion, coupled with the larger tweeters, these speakers produce rich, deep basses, amazing midtones, and beautiful crystal clear sound sans editing. Spatial audio with Dolby Atmos. Does it really work as advertised? I was pretty skeptical, but this is actually incredible. It really does sound like surround sound. It absolutely blew me away. If you have an Apple store nearby, you really just have to go listen to it for yourself. Go to Apple Music and search for music supported with Dolby Atmos. You have to hear this for yourself. What about the 3 studio quality mic array with significantly decreased signal to noise ratio, as Apple put it? As with the speakers, I was again surprised at how good they sound on a laptop. Also, like the spatial audio claims, I was pretty skeptical that it would work the way Apple said it does. But I'm telling you, it does. It's super amazing. I don't know if they're true studio quality, but they're really, really unexpectedly good. The voice recording tests that I performed sounded excellent. So good, in fact, that when I need to do voiceovers, recording can go straight into video without any post-production editing. Amazing for a laptop. Display. This is by far the most beautiful display I've ever seen on a computer, possibly any screen, period, ever. The Liquid Retina XDR display is just stunning. The display enclosure is thin but feels super robust and durable. The screen is super bright. With 1,000 nits of sustained and 1,600 nits of peak brightness, this makes it one of the brightest screens ever. 10,000 mini LEDs with tiny dimming zones allows for precision lighting across the screen. And 7 films and diffusers allow for a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio and a staggering billion colors on a frickin' laptop. The 10-bit LCD panel that allows for the ProMotion adaptable 120 Hz refresh rate is absolutely amazing. Except it looks like Safari needs an update to support the full 120 Hz refresh rate. It does get just a bit noticeably choppy in Safari. Everything else looks great. The 16-inch model has 7.7 million pixels and the 14-inch model 5.9 pixels. For comparison, the 14-inch model has more pixels than the previous generation 16-inch model. Both have 254 pixels per inch, more pixel density than on the Pro XDR display. Another very welcome change is the bezels. On both the 14 and 16-inch models, the bezels are significantly reduced, just 3.5 millimeters on the top and on the sides. That's 24% thinner on the sides and 60% smaller on the top. All of this together makes for a display experience second to none, all while conserving battery life and decreasing energy consumption. In real-world use, simply put, it's super bright, super crisp, and buttery smooth. Okay, we have to talk about the proverbial elephant in the room, the oft-dreaded, universally despised, consistently hated, dare I say it, notch. Okay, the reality is, it really isn't that bad. First, in dark mode, it's barely visible. Second, it's incorporated into the menu bar, so it doesn't reduce screen real estate at all. My brain really has very quickly managed to just tune it out, so I really don't even notice it at all. And I promise your brain will do the same. You won't even notice it after a couple of days of use. Third, it completely disappears in full screen mode. And finally, and this may be one of the most important factors for many of us, Face ID. If we want Face ID on the MacBook Pro, there will, out of necessity, be a notch, at least for the foreseeable future. So, I think it's safe to say, hate it or despise it, because nobody loves it, the notch is here to stay, at least for now. Battery life. Incredible. The 14-inch model has a 70-watt battery, while the 16-inch model is equipped with an FAA limited 100-watt battery. The largest battery you can put in a laptop and take it on an airplane. Truly all-day battery life for most use, including video playback and streaming. Not quite that long with video editing, but the fast charger juices it up really, really fast. Bottom line, best battery on the market. I rarely have to charge it during daily use. Camera. The new 1080p camera with Apple's ISP, or image signal processing, is definitely a vast improvement over the abysmal piece of crap 720p camera of previous generations. How they called that HD was really a joke, but I guess for 8 years ago it probably was HD. But this camera, while not ideal, produces a very nice and usable image for video conferencing, FaceTime, or Zoom. Now, Apple has designed these new machines for pro users, and they absolutely are pro machines. That said, there are a few things I'd like to see added, changed, upgraded, tweaked. The ports are great. Thank you, Apple, for finally bringing them back. But these actually should be equipped with HDMI 2.1 instead of 2.0, and the SDXC card slot should certainly be UHS 3 for faster transfer speeds. For pros, time is money. These are pro machines. Give us pro ports. Design. A small thing, but I think a really noticeable thing. And I really love the etched MacBook Pro, but why? Why Apple isn't on the bottom? It's absolutely gorgeous, but you can't see it. Why isn't it on the top of the display enclosure, right under the Apple logo where you can actually see it? I love it, it's gorgeous, let us see it. The charging brick. Okay, this is really a pet peeve, and I just have to say, come on, Apple. At this price point, for $2,000 for the entry-level model, every MacBook Pro should come with at least the 96-watt fast charge brick. Do you really need to nickel and dime people for 20 bucks to upgrade the charging brick? Seriously. Okay, the camera. Like I said, the camera is a significant upgrade, and it really is. But with so many professionals working from home now and using video conferencing, it's really time for a 4K camera on the MacBook Pro. Again, at this price point, $2,000 for the entry-level model, a 4K camera should be standard, but at least, at the very least, offer it as an option. And bringing center stage to the MacBook Pro would be great, and arguably a necessity. Okay, Face ID. Enough said about that. Let's get Face ID on the MacBook Pro. Okay, Touch Bar. Now, I know most of you hated the Touch Bar, but just hear me out. There is a method to the madness. The Touch Bar was a really cool concept. The problem was Apple completely neglected it. It was never upgraded or updated. Because of that, I really only used the Touch Bar consistently for a couple of things. Like I said, volume control slider and the screen brightness slider. So, what if there was a Touch Bar just for these functions? That would free up five keys on the function key row. Those keys could then be customizable shortcuts to open your 5 most used apps. Instead of using your mouse to go to the dock, point and click, just hit a shortcut key and voila, open app. And there are certainly other ways you could integrate a modified Touch Bar into the MacBook Pro while keeping the function key row intact. Just a thought. So now that we've pretty much gone through this thing inside and out, top to bottom, let's talk bottom line. For the past 5 years, Apple was entirely too focused on thin and light. They almost totally neglected function and performance. Well, that has changed with 2021. Apple has finally listened and admitted they were wrong. Wrong about several things. The Touch Bar, the butterfly keyboard, the belief that USB-C would replace all the other ports, and possibly worst of all, its obsession again with thin and light while neglecting the innovation or function and performance. It seems that the nightmare is over. This is a massive, massive win for Apple, Apple fans, pro users alike, and people that may be considering switching from PC to Mac. Apple has finally swallowed its pride. It's finally listened. Apple has finally delivered. This is the pro machine pro users have been begging for years. And again, there is so much to love about the new MacBook Pro. The design is elegantly clean and simple, and just a little nostalgic. Truly outstanding performance with minuscule power consumption. My best real-life example is Final Cut. This is our latest video, our unboxing of the M1 Max. Let's take a look. It's a 50 gig 4K clip, and let's add some text, some effects, transitions, layers, and even some third-party plugins. And even with all that, with all those layers and other additions, it still works beautifully. It is simply amazing. No dropped frames, no stuttering, it just runs silky smooth. This has made my editing workflow so much more fluid and smooth, so much faster, and really, so much more of a joy to work with. Simply because, as Steve Jobs said,
it just all works. It just works.
And it really does. It just works. It works the way you want it to. It works the way it should work. It works the way you expect it to work. It just works. And when you consider performance per watt, Apple Silicon is industry leading. No, it's really industry destroying. Now, there may be other processors out there right now that outperform Apple Silicon by a little bit. Their problem is power consumption and thermals. With those rate limiting factors, it's hard to see how these processors will even keep up with, much less continue to outperform Apple Silicon, especially considering this is just the M1 series, the first generation of Apple processors. Apple has created a chip that is years ahead of the competition and nothing short of revolutionary. So, would I recommend it? That's a big ol', absolute, undoubted, without hesitation or reservation, hell yeah, you betcha. This is some next level shit. That said, here are a few thoughts and recommendations on who should actually buy the new MacBook Pro. Look, if you've got money to burn and you just want and can afford the latest and greatest, then sure, absolutely, go for it. You'll be thrilled. If you're a pro doing high-end video editing, photography, sound, animation, then absolutely go for it. As I said, this is the pro laptop pro users have been waiting for. This is absolutely a badass beast that you're gonna love. If you're in the market for a new computer though, and you don't need the latest and greatest, you don't need all the bells and whistles, you're a student, a consumer level user for internet, FaceTime, word processing, Keynote, PowerPoint presentations, relatively less intensive tasks, or you're just on a budget, then I'd really recommend the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro, the M1 MacBook Air, or even the M1 iPad Pro. With any of these, you're still going to get a great machine with great Apple Silicon processor. You may not be getting all the bells and whistles, but you will get an outstanding, super fast machine at a much lower cost that will last you for years. One exception. If you're a gamer and you're looking for a gaming machine, while these M1 Macs are getting better, gaming on the Mac still lags. So for gaming, I'd still have to recommend PC, but watch out PC, that may be changing too. So let's wrap this thing up. If you stuck around for this entire video, you're my hero. In upcoming videos, we're gonna take a look at 2022 predictions for WWDC, iPhone 14, Apple Silicon, iMac, and a whole lot more. So stay tuned, you won't want to miss any of it. So go ahead, if you like this video, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, share, comment, and smash that bell so you don't miss an iTalk video. I'm Richard, this is iTalk. Thanks so much for watching. Until the next one, we'll catch you on the flip side. We are out.